My fingers no longer exist. Not in the way you understand fingers. I possess articulated bone structures wrapped in scar tissue so dense it resembles the parchment I write upon. When I move them, and I must move them, always must move them, they make sounds like dried leaves crumpling. The acid has eaten through nerve, muscle, tendon, skin. What remains are functional tools, writing implements. That is what I have become, after all. Not a man, a pen that breathes. But I was a man once. My name was Calyx Thorn. I was 19 years old when they selected me. I had all my fingers then. I had dreams. I had a father who worked the reclamation forges on Hive Tertius, melting down the bodies of the dead to extract usable metals. He would come home each night with his clothes stinking of rendered fat and chemical dissolution, and he would sit at our Hab unit's single table and read to me from forbidden texts. Not heretical, understand, but simply old. Pre-imperial. Stories about men who chose their own paths, who wrote what they wanted to write. Words have power, Calyx, he told me the night before the selection. His hands were scarred from forge work, the skin mottled and thick. Real power, not the false power of tyrants who call themselves divine, but the power to preserve truth. Remember that. I wish I had understood what he meant. I wish I had run. The Adeptus Musculum came to Hive Tertius during the season of counting, when the Administratum conducts its census to determine how many bodies the Hive owes the Imperium that year. We called it the Season of Vanishing because young men disappeared into the Guard, into servitor conversion facilities, into roles we never fully understood. The propaganda broadcasts promised glory and purpose. They told us the Emperor protects those who serve. My father would mute the broadcasts and tell me to trust only what I could see with my own eyes. The Musculum selection criteria were specific. They needed hands that were steady, eyes that were sharp, minds that were disciplined. They administered tests across 17 days, winnowing 10,000 candidates down to 100, then 50, then 20. Then me. I stood in a chamber carved from rockcrete 3 miles below the Hive's surface, surrounded by 19 other young men who looked as terrified as I felt. We ranged from 17 to 23 years old. We had names, families, lives we'd been pulled from. The Musculum magister who addressed us was ancient, his body more augmetic than flesh, his voice emanating from a vox grill embedded in his throat. "You have been chosen for the Emperor's great work," he said, the words crackling with distortion. The propaganda line, delivered without inflection or emotion. You will serve the Adeptus Musculum as Gene-Scribes, preserving the sacred genetic templates of the Adeptus Astartes. You will transcribe the codes that make gods from men. This is the highest honor. Honor. That word tasted like ash even then, though I didn't yet know why. They led us deeper, always deeper. The temperature dropped. The walls became smoother, less industrial, more organic somehow. We passed through checkpoints where servo skulls scanned our retinas and took genetic samples. We walked for what felt like hours, descending through levels that predated the Hive's current structure. Pre-imperial architecture, perhaps, or older still. Finally, we reached the scriptorium. I will never forget my first sight of it. The chamber was vast, so vast the ceiling disappeared into darkness despite the lumens burning every 10 meters along the walls. Row upon row of writing desks stretched into that darkness, each one occupied by a hunched figure bent over parchment. There were hundreds of them, thousands perhaps, all writing. The sound was overwhelming. The scratch of stylus on vellum multiplied 10,000 times into a susurrus that sounded like insects devouring flesh. "Your workstation awaits," the Magister said. "You will write. You will transcribe the genetic perfection of the God Emperor's angels. You will not stop. You will not fail. The Emperor protects those who serve without error." They assigned me to Station 4721. The desk was made of dark wood, real wood, impossibly rare and valuable, worn smooth by countless hands before mine. Upon it sat a single sheet of parchment, cream-colored and oddly textured. Beside it was a stylus and an inkwell filled with liquid the color of fresh blood. The Gene-Scribe at Station 4720 glanced at me. He was perhaps 30 years old, though it was hard to tell. His face was gaunt, hollowed out by exhaustion or pain or both. His hands were wrapped in bandages that were stained through with fluids I couldn't identify. When he saw me looking, he turned away quickly, hunching over his work. "Read the instructions," a proctor said, placing a data slate on my desk. "Memorize them. You begin in 1 hour." The instructions were simple, horrifyingly simple. You will transcribe genetic sequences from the source template to vellum parchment. Each sequence contains approximately 47,000 characters and must be copied with perfect accuracy. You will use the provided stylus and genetic ink. You will not wear gloves. You will not use magnification. You will work in 12-hour shifts with one 10-minute break for sustenance. If you produce an error, the parchment will be incinerated along with the hand that erred. If you produce 3 errors in 1 month, you will be converted to servitor status. If you refuse to work, you will be executed for dereliction of duty. The Emperor protects the faithful. I read that last line 3 times, hearing my father's voice in my head. Trust only what you can see. I looked at the Gene-Scribe beside me, at his bandaged hands, at the scribes stretching into the darkness, all hunched, all writing, all silent except for that terrible insect sound of stylus on flesh. I understood then. This was not honor, this was consumption. But understanding came too late. The door had sealed behind us. The proctor was walking away. My hour of preparation was ticking down. I picked up the stylus. It was surprisingly light, made of some metal I didn't recognize. I uncapped the inkwell, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. Sharp, acidic, chemical. It made my eyes water. My stomach turned. "Don't," the scribe beside me whispered, his voice hoarse. "Don't smell it. Breathe through your mouth. It's worse if you think about what it is." "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. He bent back to his work, stylus moving with mechanical precision across parchment that I now realized was not paper at all. The texture, the faint pattern of pores, the way it seemed to absorb the ink. Human skin. I was going to write genetic codes, the building blocks of the Emperor's angels, the sacred templates of transhuman warriors, onto vellum made from human skin, using ink that smelled like it could dissolve flesh. The propaganda claimed this was holy work, that we preserved the perfection of those the Imperium called gods among men, that this service brought us closer to the divine purpose of humanity's corpse-lord ruler. My father's voice, "Trust what you see." I saw prisoners being consumed. I saw a system that devoured human beings and called it sacred duty. I saw my own doom settling onto my shoulders like a shroud. The first source template appeared on a pick screen that descended from the darkness above my station. Rows of characters in genetic cipher, as T's, G's, C's, arranged in sequences that meant nothing to me but apparently contained within them the instructions for building demigods. Each character was perhaps 2 millimeters tall on the screen. I would have to copy them at the same scale onto the vellum, maintaining perfect accuracy across 47,000 characters. 12 hours to complete one sheet, then another, forever, or until I failed 3 times, or until my body simply stopped functioning. I dipped my stylus into the ink. The smell intensified, making my head swim. I positioned the tip against the vellum, the human skin, and began to write. The pain started immediately. The ink was acid, not metaphorically, not hyperbolically, literally acid, designed to etch into the vellum at a molecular level, bonding the genetic information to the substrate in a way that would preserve it for millennia. The data slate had called it genetic ink, as if that were a neutral description of a tool. But it was acid, and we were required to work without gloves because, according to Musculum doctrine, the human touch was necessary to channel the sacred precision required for the Emperor's work. More lies, more propaganda masking the simple truth. Gloves would have reduced the suffering, and suffering was the point. Suffering was how the Imperium ground its people into components. Suffering was the mechanism of control. The acid touched my fingertips every time I dipped the stylus into the inkwell. At first it was only a tingling sensation, uncomfortable but bearable. By the end of the first hour, it had progressed to burning, a persistent, intense heat that felt like holding my hand too close to a forge. By hour 3, I understood that the burning would never stop. It would only intensify until it reached some unbearable threshold, and then my nerves would die. And then I wouldn't feel it anymore, but by then the damage would be so extensive that my fingers would be little more than bone wrapped in chemical burns. I watched it happen in real time. The skin on my right index finger, the one that held the stylus, that bore the most exposure to the acid, began to redden within the first hour. By hour 2, the epidermis was weeping clear fluid. By hour 4, the skin had turned white and began to slough off in patches, revealing raw dermis beneath. By hour 6, I could see subcutaneous tissue, yellow-white fat deposits visible through gaps in my dissolving skin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to stop. But the proctor walked the aisles between stations, watching for any sign of hesitation. At hour 5, a scribe 3 rows ahead of me stopped writing and simply stared at his hands, which were in worse condition than mine. The bones of his fingers were visible through the eroded flesh. The proctor approached him. No words were exchanged. The proctor simply made a notation on his data slate, and 2 servitors appeared from the shadows. They were massive things, all hydraulic muscle and dead eyes, and they lifted the scribe from his station with mechanical efficiency. His screaming echoed through the scriptorium for perhaps 30 seconds before being cut off by the sound of a door sealing. We never saw him again, but we all understood. Refusal meant death, or worse, conversion, becoming the very servitors that now patrolled the aisles, consciousness trapped in a body that existed only to enforce the suffering of others. So I didn't stop. I kept writing. ATGC, thousands of them, tens of thousands. My hand moved like a servitor's piston, regular, mechanical, without thought. The pain became a constant background scream that my mind learned to categorize as normal. The skin continued to dissolve. By hour 8, I was essentially writing with exposed muscle tissue. By hour 10, that muscle had turned gray-white and necrotic. By hour 12, when the shift ended and the lumens dimmed to signal our brief break, I looked down at my hands and barely recognized them as human. The scribe beside me, the one who'd warned me not to smell the ink, had hands in similar condition. Worse, actually. His right hand was more bone than tissue, the phalanges visible through gaps in the flesh like islands in a sea of chemical burns. He was cradling it against his chest, not moving, just staring into the middle distance. "First shift?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I managed. My throat was raw from breathing the acidic fumes that rose from the inkwell. "It gets worse," he said, not cruelly, just stating a fact. "The nerves die after a while, so the pain lessens. But then you lose sensation entirely, and you have to write by sight alone, watching to make sure your fingers are moving correctly because you can't feel them anymore. And the cold starts, the permanent cold, because there's no flesh left to retain heat." "How long have you been here?" I asked. He thought about it, or maybe he was just trying to remember. 4 years. Maybe 5. The days blur together. They tell us we serve the Emperor's great work, that transcribing the genetic codes of his angels brings us closer to divinity. He laughed, a sound like tearing paper. I was taught to believe he protects the faithful. But look at us. Look at what we become in his service. If this is protection, I'd hate to see abandonment. The 10-minute break ended. The lumens brightened. We returned to our stations and picked up our styluses with our ruined hands, and we wrote. We wrote because stopping meant death. We wrote because the system demanded it. We wrote the genetic perfection of god warriors while our own bodies rotted away, cell by cell, because that was the function we'd been assigned. The Emperor protects, the propaganda claimed. But my dissolving fingers told a different truth. Week 3. That's when I learned to compartmentalize the pain. Not to eliminate it, that was impossible, but to create a mental space where it existed in parallel to my consciousness, rather than consuming it entirely. The pain became like the scratch of styluses around me. Constant background noise I learned to filter out. My hands no longer looked human. The skin was entirely gone from my fingers, replaced by scar tissue so thick and white it resembled the vellum I wrote upon. The acid had burned away nerve endings in some places while leaving them hypersensitive in others, creating a patchwork of numbness and agony that shifted unpredictably. Sometimes I would write for hours, feeling nothing, my fingers moving like mechanical components. Other times, a single brush of the stylus would send lightning bolts of pain up my arm that made my vision white out. The Musculum provided no medical care, no analgesics, no treatment beyond the most basic sustenance required to keep us functional. We received corpse starch rations once per shift, gray-brown blocks that tasted of nothing and sat in the stomach like clay, and 8 hours of sleep in coffin bunks stacked 17 high in dormitory chambers adjacent to the scriptorium. No recreation, no music or entertainment, no contact with the outside world, only work, sleep, until our body failed or we made too many errors. I learned the rhythm of the scriptorium, the patterns. At hour 4 of each shift, the pain would peak as my rebuilt nerve endings died again under fresh acid exposure. At hour 7, A wave of exhaustion would hit as my body depleted its energy reserves. At hour 11, I would enter a dissociative state where my consciousness seemed to float above my body, watching myself right from a distance, detached from the suffering. They called this state the trance, and the senior scribe spoke of it with something approaching reverence, as if it were a mystical experience rather than a psychological defense mechanism against unendurable trauma. "You're approaching transcendence," one of them told me during a brief exchange at the ration dispensary. His name was Dorian, and he'd been writing for 9 years. His hands were barely recognizable as hands anymore, just articulated bone structures with the absolute minimum flesh required for the muscles to function. When you write in the trance, you channel the Emperor's will directly. You become an instrument of his divine purpose. Propaganda, conditioning, lies we told ourselves to make the horror bearable. There was no divinity in this, no transcendence, only trauma responses dressed up in religious language to make us complicit in our own consumption. But I said nothing. I nodded. I ate my corpse starch. I returned to my station and picked up my stylus and wrote another 47,000 characters onto human skin with acid that ate my fingers down to bone. By week 6, I'd completed 42 parchments without error. My station supervisor, a wizened man whose title was Gene Proctor and whose body was more augmetic than flesh, informed me that this was above-average performance. He said the words without inflection, as if commenting on a servitor's fuel efficiency. No praise, no acknowledgement of the pain it had cost, just data. "Maintain this accuracy rate, and you'll avoid servitor conversion," he said. "The Emperor protects the diligent." I wanted to scream at him, to ask how the Emperor was protecting me when my hands were rotting away, to demand what divine purpose was served by my suffering. But the servo skulls recorded everything, and questioning doctrine meant execution. So I nodded. I thanked him for his assessment. I returned to my work. That night in my coffin bunk, I tried to remember my father's face. I closed my eyes and reached for the memory. Him sitting at our HAB unit's table, the ancient book open before him, his scarred hands steady on the pages. But the memory was slipping. The details were fading. I could remember that he had hands, that they were scarred. But I couldn't remember the specific pattern of the scars, couldn't remember if his eyes were brown or gray, couldn't remember the exact timbre of his voice. The scriptorium was eating my past along with my present. The constant, grinding horror of each shift was consuming my mental resources, leaving no space for anything except survival. Memories became luxuries I couldn't afford. Identity became a burden too heavy to carry. I was becoming my function, a pen that breathed. Week 7, I made my first error. I don't know how it happened. One moment I was transcribing a particularly complex sequence, strings of GTACCTG as that all looked identical, and the next the vellum was smoking. Not metaphorically, literally smoking, wisps of gray-white vapor rising from the parchment where I'd written a T instead of a C. The error was perhaps 2 millimeters wide. I'd transposed a single character in a sequence of 47,000. The parchment ignited instantly, flash burning with a chemical intensity that suggested it was impregnated with something flammable. The flames were blue-white and unnaturally hot. I jerked my hand back instinctively, but I was too slow. The fire caught my right hand, the one holding the stylus, and for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. I experienced pain of a quality and intensity I hadn't thought possible. The flames weren't just burning my flesh. They were consuming it at a molecular level, disintegrating the tissue into ash and smoke. A proctor appeared with a fire suppression servitor. Chemical foam extinguished the flames. Medical servitors clamped restraints on my arms and sprayed my hand with some kind of cellular stabilizer that stopped the damage from spreading. But the damage was done. My right hand from the wrist to the fingertips was charred black, the flesh cracked and weeping clear fluid. 2 of my fingers, the index and middle, were burned down to bone. "First error," the proctor said, making a notation on his data slate. "Hand will regenerate sufficiently for work resumption in 6 days. You will work with your left hand until then. Second error results in conversion to servitor status. The Emperor punishes the unfaithful." They didn't remove me from my station. They simply gave me a new stylus designed for left-handed use and a fresh sheet of vellum. I was expected to continue working, to transcribe another 47,000 characters with my non-dominant hand, while my dominant hand hung useless at my side, radiating pain that made my previous suffering seem like a gentle warmth. I wrote. What else could I do? I wrote with my left hand, slowly, clumsily, each character taking 3 times as long. My accuracy dropped, my speed plummeted, but I didn't stop, because stopping meant death. 6 days later, my right hand had regenerated. The medical servitors had done something to accelerate the healing process, injected growth factors, applied bioscaffolding, stimulated cellular division. The result was tissue that looked vaguely like flesh, but felt wrong. The texture was off. The color was wrong. The sensation was minimal, as if I were wearing thick gloves that I couldn't remove. But it functioned. The fingers moved when I told them to move. They gripped the stylus. They wrote. I returned to 12-hour shifts. I wrote another 47 parchments without error. I existed in a state of permanent exhaustion and low-grade agony that became my new baseline. The trance became my only refuge. Those hours where my consciousness disconnected from my body and I became pure function. Month 4. I realized I couldn't remember what it felt like to not be in pain. I tried to imagine hands that didn't hurt, fingers that had sensation, skin that wasn't scar tissue. But I couldn't. The suffering had become so normalized that I'd lost the reference point for what normal felt like. Month 6. They moved me to a more advanced station. Apparently my above-average performance qualified me for work on more complex genetic sequences. The templates I transcribed now contained not just the basic Astartes genome, but modifications specific to individual chapters. Each sequence required additional precision, additional focus, the potential for error multiplied. My hands were barely recognizable by this point. The repeated cycles of acid exposure, error punishment burning, and forced regeneration had left them as patchwork constructions of scar tissue, chemically hardened flesh, and visible bone. When I moved my fingers, I could hear the tendons creaking, bone grinding against bone where the cartilage had dissolved. I looked at the other scribes, the ones who'd been here longer than me, and saw my future. Dorian, 9 years in, had hands that looked like medical diagrams of hand anatomy, all the surface features stripped away to reveal the underlying structure. Matthias, 12 years in, had undergone augmetic reinforcement, his finger bone replaced with metal rods that didn't corrode under the acid. but his consciousness was visibly eroding along with his flesh. He spoke in fragmented sentences, his thoughts disjointed and mechanical. "We are blessed," he told me once, his eyes unfocused, "to serve the Emperor's work, to preserve perfection. We are. He trailed off, seemingly forgetting what he was trying to say. Then, "The stylus moves. The code is written. That is sufficient." Sufficient. What a word. What a perfectly horrifying word for a life reduced to pure function. Month 8. I made my second error. This time it wasn't a transcription mistake. This time, my hand simply failed. I was halfway through a complex sequence when my right index finger, the one that had been burned to bone and regenerated twice, locked in position. The tendon had finally given out, snapping under the accumulated stress of months of work. My finger froze mid-character, and the stylus dragged across the vellum in an uncontrolled line that ruined the entire sequence. The parchment ignited. The flames consumed my hand again. The proctor made his notation. Second error. One more error results in mandatory servitor conversion. The Emperor permits no third failure. This time the regeneration took 12 days. This time they replaced my damaged tendon with a synthetic fiber that would resist acid corrosion. The medical servitor that performed the procedure didn't use anesthetic. I was conscious for the entire operation, feeling every incision, every insertion, every suture. They told me pain was good. Pain kept you alert. Pain reminded you that service required sacrifice. When I returned to work, my hand moved differently. The synthetic tendon didn't stretch like natural tissue. It had no give, no flex. My finger movements became mechanical, precise in a way that felt inhuman, which I suppose was the point. Humanity was being engineered out of me, replaced component by component with things that functioned more reliably. Chapter 1. My 1-year anniversary at Station 4721 passed without acknowledgement. I'd transcribed 1,457 parchments over 69 million characters, with 2 errors. By scriptorium standards, this was exceptional performance. My reward was permission to continue existing. No celebration, no recognition, just another shift, another template, another 47,000 characters to copy with my ruined hands onto human skin. I tried to remember my father's voice that night, tried to hear him reading from those forbidden books, telling me words had power. But the memory was almost entirely gone. I knew intellectually that I'd had a father. I knew his name had been something beginning with H or J or maybe M. But I couldn't reconstruct his face, couldn't remember what he'd looked like or sounded like or how his presence had felt. The scriptorium had consumed my past. I existed only in an eternal present of stylus and vellum and acid and pain. Year 2. I stopped thinking of myself as Calyx. That name belonged to a person who no longer existed, who'd been progressively dismantled and rebuilt as a functional tool. I was Station 4721 now. That was how the proctors referred to me. That was how I thought of myself during the trance. Not a person with a name and a history, but a designation, a component in a larger system. My hands had achieved a kind of equilibrium. The acid still burned the flesh, but the rate of damage had equalized with the rate of forced regeneration. I existed in a steady state of partial dissolution, my fingers perpetually hovering at the edge of structural failure, but never quite crossing that line. The pain was constant and immense, but it had long since stopped being surprising. It was simply the baseline condition of existence. Year 3. They began the mental conditioning in earnest. I hadn't realized the physical suffering was only the first layer. The Musculum didn't just want functional scribes. They wanted us to be psychologically complicit in our own consumption, to accept the horror not as horror but as holy purpose, to embrace the degradation as sacred service. The conditioning was subtle at first. Subliminal phrases embedded in the picked screens we stared at for 12 hours every shift. Audio messages played at frequencies just below conscious perception during our 8-hour sleep cycles. Incense burned in the scriptorium that contained mild psychoactive compounds designed to increase suggestibility and compliance. The Emperor protects through our service. We were taught to repeat during mandatory prayer assemblies that interrupted our shifts every third day. Our suffering purifies, our sacrifice sanctifies. To write the code of angels is to partake in divinity. Lies. All lies. But lies repeated 10,000 times begin to sound like truth, especially when you're sleep-deprived, malnourished, and in constant pain. Especially when the alternative to believing the lies is accepting that your suffering is meaningless, that you're being consumed for no purpose beyond the Imperium's bottomless hunger for human components. Some scribes broke under the conditioning. Their minds couldn't withstand the cognitive dissonance between the horror of their existence and the propaganda they were forced to internalize. They would stand up in the middle of a shift and begin screaming about the God Emperor's glory, about how they were blessed to serve, about how the pain was sacred and the suffering was mercy. The proctors would let them scream for a few minutes. It served as a useful example to the rest of us, before the servitors dragged them away for psychiatric reconditioning. None of them ever returned. But we would see them later sometimes, patrolling the aisles. New servitors, fresh ones. Their faces still recognizable beneath the augmetics and the lobotomy scar. Their eyes still vaguely human, though everything behind those eyes had been scraped out and replaced with command protocols. I didn't break. I couldn't afford to break. Breaking meant losing the last fragments of myself, becoming completely absorbed into the system. So I developed a different strategy. Compliance without belief. I repeated the prayers when required, but I never let the words penetrate beyond my lips. I worked with mechanical efficiency, but I never let myself believe the propaganda about divine purpose and sacred service. Trust what you see, my father had told me. A fragment of memory I clung to like a drowning man clings to driftwood. Trust what you see. I saw men being consumed. I saw bodies being rendered into components. I saw a system that called horror holy and suffering service. I saw prayers going unanswered, saw faith rewarded only with more degradation. I saw the corpse emperor's protection was nothing but propaganda used to justify grinding his own citizens into raw materials. Year 4, the psychological erosion became harder to resist. The sleep deprivation, the sensory monotony, the constant pain, the chemical conditioning. All of it worked in concert to wear away the boundaries of my consciousness, to smooth down the rough edges of my personality, until I was as uniform and interchangeable as the styluses we used. I began to lose time, not minutes or hours, but days. Entire shifts would pass in the trance, and I would wake to find another parchment completed, Another sequence perfectly transcribed, with no memory of having written it. My body had become so thoroughly trained that it could perform its function without my conscious participation. I was becoming automated, my consciousness an unnecessary component in the mechanical process of transferring genetic data from screen to vellum. The other scribes noticed. "You're achieving true trance," Dorian told me with something approaching pride. He'd been here 13 years now, and he looked like a corpse that someone had forgot to bury. His flesh was translucent, the blood vessels and muscle fibers visible beneath skin that had the texture of waxed paper. "You're becoming a pure channel for the Emperor's work. This is transcendence." Transcendence. Beautiful word for a horrifying process. My consciousness was dissolving, my identity eroding, and they called it transcendence. Called it a blessing. Called it proof of the Emperor's favor. I wanted to scream that there was no transcendence, only trauma. That I wasn't achieving enlightenment, but experiencing the mental breakdown of a mind pushed beyond its tolerance. That every moment I spent in the trance was another piece of myself that I lost forever. But the servo skulls were always watching. And I'd already made 2 errors. One more, and servitor conversion was mandatory. So I said nothing. I nodded. I thanked Dorian for recognizing my spiritual progress. And I returned to my station and picked up my stylus with my nightmare hands, and wrote another sequence, and another, while my mind slowly came untethered from my body. Year 5. I realized I was no longer entirely certain what I looked like. We had no mirrors in the scriptorium, no reflective surfaces. We saw our hands constantly, impossible not to, but the rest of our bodies existed in a kind of blind spot. I knew I'd lost weight. I could feel my ribs through my skin, feel the sharp angles of my hips and shoulders. But I couldn't visualize my face. Couldn't remember if I'd had a beard or what color my hair was, or whether my eyes were still in my head or had been replaced with augmetics at some point, and I'd simply failed to notice because I was too deep in the trance. Month 60. I made my 3rd error. It happened during a particularly complex sequence, a genetic code for the Primaris upgrade package, thousands of modifications layered into the base Astartes genome. I'd been working for 11 hours straight, transcribing with the mechanical precision that had become my only mode of existence. My consciousness was barely present. I was pure function, stylus and hand and eye all acting in concert, without thought, without awareness, without... I don't remember making the mistake. One moment I was writing, and the next the vellum was burning. Not just smoking, burning with the intense blue-white flame that meant a catastrophic error. A misplaced character that had triggered the parchment's immolation protocol. The fire consumed my right hand instantly. I'd experienced this twice before, so my body knew how to respond. Pull back, don't scream, wait for the fire suppression servitor. But this time was different. This time was the 3rd time. The proctor appeared. He looked at his data slate. He looked at me. His face, what was visible beneath the augmetics, showed no emotion whatsoever. 3rd error, he said. Station 4721 is designated for servitor conversion. The Emperor purges the unreliable. No, I'd been so careful. 5 years of work. 2,738 parchments transcribed. Over 128 million characters copied with perfect accuracy, except for 3 errors. 3 mistakes out of 128 million chances to fail, and that wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough for the Imperium's hunger. "Please," I said. My voice was hoarse from disuse. We almost never spoke in the scriptorium. "I can do better. I'll be more careful. Please, Compliance is mandatory," the proctor said. He made a gesture, and 2 servitors materialized from the shadows. Massive things, dead-eyed and mechanical, their augmetic hands closing around my arms with hydraulic strength I couldn't possibly resist. They dragged me from Station 4721. I watched my desk recede into the distance, watched another scribe being led to take my place. Some fresh candidate, still young, still possessed of human-looking hands, still believing whatever lies they'd told him about honor and service. I wanted to scream a warning, to tell him to run, to tell him the Emperor doesn't protect, the system only consumes, the sacred work is just horror dressed in theological language. But my voice wouldn't work, and even if it had, the servo skulls would have registered the heresy, and they would have killed him as a precaution, and his death would have been my fault. So I said nothing. I let the servitors drag me away from the scriptorium, down corridors I'd never seen, toward a fate I'd watched others suffer but never imagined I would face. The servitor conversion facility was clean, clinically clean. White walls, white floors, white everything, all illuminated by harsh lumens that left no shadows. Medical servitors moved with mechanical efficiency, preparing a conversion cradle, a reclining chair festooned with cables and surgical implements and things I didn't have names for. Subject 4721 designated for lobotomy and augmetic integration, one of the servitors said, its voice flat and emotionless. Consciousness will be reduced to base functions. Higher cognitive processes will be excised. Subject will serve as labor servitor, designation pending assignment. They were going to scoop out my mind, remove everything that made me me, every memory, every thought, every scrap of consciousness, and leave only enough neural function to follow basic commands. I would become exactly what I'd feared, a tool, a functional component. Aware enough to suffer, but not aware enough to understand or resist. The servitors strapped me into the conversion cradle. Restraints locked around my wrists, ankles, chest, forehead. I couldn't move anything except my eyes. A medical servitor approached with a device that looked like a crown made of surgical drills, each one positioned to pierce my skull at specific points. "This will hurt," the servitor said. Not as a warning, just as a statement of fact. Pain responses will be active during the procedure to ensure compliance. Screaming is expected and will be ignored. They lowered the crown toward my head. The drills began to spin, whining like angry insects. I could smell ozone and sterilization chemicals. I could see my reflection in the polished surface of the surgical implements. Gaunt face, hollow eyes, skin stretched tight over bone. I looked like a corpse. I looked like I'd been dead for years and just hadn't realized it. The drills touched my skull. Pain, pain beyond description, pain beyond endurance. The drills bored through bone with surgical precision, penetrating cranium, piercing meninges, sliding into brain tissue. I felt every millimeter of penetration, every nerve they severed, every neuron they destroyed. I screamed. Of course I screamed. Everyone screams during conversion. The servitors ignore it. They've heard it 10,000 times. One more screaming subject is just background noise. The drills went deeper. I felt something fundamental shifting in my consciousness. Memories began to fragment. I tried to hold on to them. My father's voice, the stories he read, the forbidden books, the words about power and truth, but they were dissolving like sugar in water. Structures collapsing as the drills destroyed the neural architecture that stored them. I was being erased, deleted, formatted like a corrupted data core. And then something went wrong. I don't know what. A mechanical failure, perhaps. A drill deviating from its programmed path. A targeting error in the conversion protocol. But one of the drills penetrated deeper than intended, piercing through the planned excision zone into areas that should have remained intact. Warning symbols flashed on the medical servitor's picked screen. Error. Error. Lobotomy incomplete. Subject consciousness partially preserved, proceeding with augmetic integration. No, they were supposed to remove my consciousness entirely. That was the mercy of servitor conversion. You didn't remain aware. You became an empty shell, following commands without thought or suffering. But they'd made a mistake. They'd destroyed enough of my brain to make me non-functional as a human being, but they'd left enough intact that I was still conscious, still aware. They were going to lock me inside a servitor body while my mind remained active. Trapped, imprisoned in meat and metal that followed programming I couldn't control. Forced to watch myself commit actions I couldn't prevent, screaming into a void that would never hear me because my voice had been disconnected from my mouth. This was worse than death, worse than complete lobotomy. This was eternal imprisonment in my own body. The augmetic integration began. They removed my arms, both of them, cut off at the shoulders and replaced with mechanical limbs that responded to base neural commands, but not to conscious will. They reinforced my spine with metal rods. They installed behavioral inhibitor chips in what remained of my brain. They carved away everything soft and human and replaced it with hard angles and cold efficiency. Through it all, I remained conscious. I felt everything. I understood everything. I just couldn't control anything. When the conversion was complete, they assigned me a designation, Servitor Unit 4721C. My purpose, to patrol the scriptorium and enforce compliance among the scribes. To be a warning and a punishment. To drag failing scribes to the very conversion facility that had just destroyed me. They activated my motor functions. My new body stood up from the conversion cradle, movements smooth and mechanical. I tried to make it stop, tried to control my limbs, to move my arms, to do anything. But the behavioral inhibitors prevented voluntary action. My consciousness was a passenger in my own body, watching helplessly as servitor programming puppeted my meat. They marched me back to the scriptorium. That was 4 centuries ago. I'm still here, still conscious, still trapped in this servitor shell that never ages, never dies, never stops functioning. 400 years of patrolling these isles, watching generation after generation of scribes arrive young and hopeful, watch them break and burn and die or convert. 400 years of dragging screaming men to the conversion facility, knowing exactly what awaits them, unable to warn them or help them, or even convey through my dead servitor eyes that I understand their terror because I live it every single day. My body doesn't belong to me. It follows its programming with mechanical precision. Walk the aisles, monitor the scribes, identify failures, report errors, drag subjects to conversion. Repeat. Forever. The behavioral inhibitors won't let me deviate even slightly from these commands. I've tried. Oh, how I've tried. Thousands of times over 4 centuries I've attempted to force my mechanical limbs to move differently, to knock over an inkwell or crush a picked screen or strangle a proctor. But the inhibitors lock down my motor functions the instant my intent deviates from programming. I am a prisoner in absolute chains. But the conversion failure left me aware. Fully, completely, perfectly aware. I experience every moment of every shift of every day with crystalline clarity. I don't sleep. Servitors don't need sleep. I don't eat or drink or feel physical comfort. I just exist in an eternal present of consciousness trapped in a cage of meat and metal. I watch the scribes. I remember what it was like to sit at station 4721, stylus in hand, acid burning my fingers. I remember the hope I'd felt on my first day, the lies they told me about honor and service. I remember my father's voice, not clearly, not completely, but fragments of memory survived the botched lobotomy. Words about power, about truth, about trusting what you see. I see everything now. I've seen it for 400 years. I've watched the Imperium grind 10,000 young men into pulp at these desks. I've watched them arrive with human hands and leave with ruined claws. I've watched them break psychologically, watched the trance consume their identities, watched them become pure function. I've watched them make their third errors and get dragged to conversion, and I've watched some of them come back as servitors like me, though most have successful lobotomies and don't remain conscious the way I do. But a few do. A few emerge from conversion with that same spark of awareness trapped behind dead eyes. I can recognize them. I don't know how. Maybe something in their movement patterns. Some microscopic deviation from perfect mechanical efficiency that suggests conscious suffering. There are 17 of us in the scriptorium right now. 17 men trapped in servitor bodies, aware but helpless, serving the same system that destroyed us. We can't communicate. The behavioral inhibitors prevent anything that might be interpreted as unauthorized interaction. But sometimes, where we pass each other in the aisles, I see something in those dead eyes that recognizes me, a flicker of consciousness, acknowledging consciousness, prisoner seeing prisoner. It's the only human contact I've had in 4 centuries. The scribes themselves never last more than a few years. The work is too destructive, even with forced regeneration and dogmatic replacement. The human body simply fails after enough exposure to the acid. The average scribe survives 4.3 years before either death or conversion. I've seen the statistics. I've watched 23,000 men cycle through these desks, each one believing he'll be different, he'll survive, he'll be the exception. None of them are. The system consumes everyone equally. New scribes arrive every month to replace the dead and converted. They're always young, teenagers and young men in their 20s, pulled from hives across the sector. They're told lies about serving the Emperor's work, about the sacred duty of preserving genetic perfection. Some resist, most don't. It makes no difference. Resistance means immediate execution. Compliance means slow destruction. Either way, the system gets what it wants. Their hands, their time, their suffering, their lives. I patrol past station 4721 17 times per shift. My old station. There's a new scribe there now. There's always a new scribe there. This one is named Marcus. I know because I heard the proctors addressing him. He's 21 years old. He's been here for 3 weeks. His hands are just beginning to show the first signs of acid damage, the reddening, the weeping flesh, the exposed dermis. He still has hope. I can see it in the way he holds his stylus, the careful precision of his movements. He still believes he can survive this, that he can maintain perfect accuracy, avoid errors, complete his service term, and return to whatever life he imagines awaits him outside. There is no service term. That's another lie. Scribes serve until they fail or die. There is no retirement, no return to normal life. The Musculum doesn't release knowledge of his methods. Everyone who enters the scriptorium either dies here or becomes part of its permanent infrastructure. Marcus will learn. They all learn, eventually, usually around month 3 when the reality of their situation fully penetrates the defensive denial that protects them during the early days. That's when they realize the prayers they whisper aren't working, that the Emperor isn't protecting them, that faith is just another tool of control, and their suffering serves no divine purpose, only the endless hunger of a system that views human beings as expendable components. I want to warn him. I want to tell him to stop writing, to refuse, to force them to kill him quickly instead of slow. But I can't. My body moves according to its programming, walking past his station with mechanical regularity, and no amount of conscious will can make it deviate even slightly. So I watch. That's all I can do. Watch and remember and suffer in silence. The other servitors don't notice. The proctors don't notice. The scribes are too focused on their own survival to notice. But I notice everything. 4 centuries have given me nothing but time to observe, to think, to understand exactly what this place is and what it means. The scriptorium is a perfect microcosm of the Imperium itself, a machine that consumes human lives and calls it holy, a system that grinds people into components and claims it's for their own good, for humanity's survival, for the Emperor's glory. A hierarchy of suffering where everyone, scribe, proctor, servitor, is trapped in roles they can't escape, perpetuating horror they claim serves some greater purpose. But there is no greater purpose. I've seen the genetic codes I spent 5 years transcribing. I've read them. In the dead hours when my servitor body stands inactive between patrol cycles, the sequences aren't divine. They're just chemistry. Complicated chemistry, yes, but ultimately just biological instructions for building larger, stronger, more durable humans. There's nothing sacred about them, nothing holy. They're tools, like any other tools, and the Adeptus Astartes they create are just soldiers, not angels. The entire theological framework that the Imperium wraps around this work, the claims of divine purpose, of holy service, of the Emperor's protection, it's all propaganda. Lies to make the scribes compliant, to make them accept the horror as sacrifice rather than recognize it as simple exploitation, to make them grind themselves to pieces willingly instead of having to be forced. And it works. Most scribes never question the doctrine. They pray to the Emperor even as their hands dissolve. They repeat the catechisms even as their minds break. They accept their destruction as holy rather than recognize it as mundane evil, because accepting the mundane evil would mean accepting that their suffering was meaningless, and human beings will believe anything rather than accept that their pain serves no purpose. I understand now what my father meant about power. Real power isn't the ability to destroy or to command or to rule. Real power is the ability to make people accept their own destruction, to make them call horror holy and suffering service, to make them complicit in the system that grinds them into paste. The Imperium has perfected that power, and places like the Scriptorium are where it's exercised most efficiently. Century 5. Marcus made his third error. I was the servitor assigned to drag him to conversion. My mechanical hands closed around his arms, arms that looked so much like mine had once looked, young and whole and human, and I marched him through the corridors to the white room where consciousness goes to die. He begged. They always beg. Please, I'll do better. I'll be perfect. Please don't do this. The Emperor protects the faithful. Please. The Emperor protects. Even now, even as the system devoured him, he repeated the propaganda, clinging to the lie because the truth, that there is no protection, no purpose, no meaning to any of this, was too terrible to accept. I wanted to tell him, the Emperor doesn't protect. The Emperor is a corpse chained to a throne, kept minimally alive by the sacrifice of thousands of psychers daily, worshipped by an institution that uses his name to justify every horror it commits. The Emperor protects nothing and no one. We are alone in our suffering, and we always have been. But I couldn't speak. My body dragged him into the conversion chamber, strapped him into the cradle, stood by as the medical servitors lowered the drill crown toward his skull. I heard his screaming. I watched another consciousness get carved into pieces. I saw him emerge as Servitor Unit 4721X, and I saw the moment when he realized, as I'd realized, as 17 others had realized, that the conversion had failed, that he was still aware, that he was trapped, the look in his eyes. The perfect, crystalline horror of understanding. That was the worst part. Not the pain of conversion, that ends. Not the loss of control, you adapt. But that first moment of realization, when you understand that you're going to be conscious in this prison forever, that there's no death coming to release you, that you'll exist in this state for decades or centuries until your servitor body finally fails, mechanically. That moment is the true horror, and I've witnessed it 127 times now. Every conversion failure, every consciousness trapped like mine. We are ghosts. We haunt the scriptorium, trapped in mechanical shells, watching the same horror repeat generation after generation. We are the Imperium's dirty secret, the cost of its brutality, the consequence of its efficiency. We are what happens when a system values function over humanity so completely that it forgets humanity was ever a consideration. Year 476. A new magister arrived to oversee the scriptorium. He was young for the position, only 140 years old, his body more augmetic than most, but less than some. He conducted an inspection of the facilities, reviewing efficiency metrics and production statistics. He noticed that conversion success rate was only 83%. That's 17% of subjects retained partial consciousness after lobotomy. This is an unacceptable failure rate, he told the proctors. Servitors should not retain awareness. Awareness reduces operational efficiency. It creates potential security issues. Why hasn't this been corrected? The proctors explained that the conversion protocols were ancient, inherited from the facility's original construction 10,000 years ago. Updating them would require mechanicus approval, which could take decades to obtain through proper bureaucratic channels. Then expedite the approval, the Magister said. I want conscious servitors eliminated within 5 years. Full lobotomy protocols only. No exceptions. Hope. For the first time in 476 years, I felt something that might have been hope. They were going to fix the conversion failure. They were going to ensure future conversions would be complete lobotomies, leaving no awareness behind. Future scribes who failed wouldn't suffer what we suffered. They'd simply cease to exist as conscious beings, which was the closest thing to mercy this place offered. But then he continued. For existing conscious servitors, immediate reconversion is authorized. Standard lobotomy protocol will be applied retroactively. Reconversion. They were going to finish the job. They were going to take the 17 of us who'd been trapped conscious for decades or centuries and complete the lobotomies that had failed the first time. They were going to erase us. Extinction. Oblivion. The absolute end of consciousness. It should have been terrifying. Instead, it was the most beautiful thing I'd heard in 5 centuries. They took us one by one. I was third. They strapped my servitor body into a conversion cradle designed for reprocessing existing servitors. The drills descended. Different drills. More precise. Designed specifically to target the fragments of consciousness that had survived the first procedure. Servitor Unit 4721C designated for consciousness excision, the medical servitor said. All higher functions will be eliminated. Unit will be restored to standard servitor baseline. The drills pierced my skull. I felt them enter my brain, felt them severing the last connections that made me me. Felt memories dissolving, thoughts fragmenting, consciousness narrowing to a point, and then nothing. Wait. No. I can still think. I'm still aware. Why am I still aware? The drills are gone. The procedure is over. But I can still think. I'm still conscious. Still trapped. What went wrong? They had better technology now, more precise instruments. They were supposed to complete the lobotomy, to erase me completely. But I'm still here. Still aware. And I understand now with sick certainty what happened. The conversion failure wasn't a glitch. It was a feature. The Mechanicus knows. They've always known. The failed lobotomies aren't failures. They're intentional, because a servitor that's still conscious suffers. And suffering has value in the Imperium's theology. Suffering is seen as purifying, sanctifying, a form of service in itself. We aren't conversion failures. We're punishment. We're warnings. We're examples of what happens to those who fail the Emperor's work. And our consciousness isn't an accident. It's the entire point. They'll never free us. They can't free us, because we serve a purpose in their theology. We are eternal penitents, suffering for our inadequacy. Our imprisonment is doctrine. Our agony is scripture. The Magister lied. There will be no mercy. There will never be mercy. The system is designed to create us, to trap us, to make us suffer forever as examples and warnings and theological necessities. I am back in the scriptorium now, Servitor Unit 4721C patrolling the aisles. There's a new scribe at Station 4721. There's always a new scribe at Station 4721. His name is Thomas. He's 19 years old. His hands are still whole and human. He believes the lies they told him about honor and service. In 3 months, he'll understand. In 3 years, he'll fail. and maybe, probably, he'll join us. Another consciousness trapped in a servitor shell, aware and helpless, suffering eternally in the name of the corpse emperor's protection. The emperor protects, they say. The propaganda broadcasts claim it. The priests chant it. The scribes whisper it as their hands dissolve in acid. But I know the truth. I've known it for 5 centuries. The emperor protects nothing. The emperor is the system, and the system exists only to consume. My name was Calyx Thorn. I was 19 years old when they selected me. I had a father who told me words had power, who taught me to trust what I could see with my own eyes. I am Servitor Unit 4721C. I have no age. My body doesn't decay. I have no family. Those memories were excised. I have no freedom. My consciousness is trapped in meat and metal that I cannot control. I am eternal. I am aware. I am suffering. And I will never, ever be free. The stylus moves. The acid burns. The system perpetuates. Forever.